during the triumphal entry that all the Jews who had gathered in Jerusalem at the time weren't just there to worship like they usually did, year by year by year. This now was going to see Jesus. Jesus was the topmost priority on a lot of people's minds. He was the subject that everybody wanted to talk about. So much so that he hadn't shown up yet, and so people were saying, well, do you think he's just not going to show up? Well, of course he's going to show up. And so 6 days prior, he goes to Bethany, where, remember, this is a little bit outside of Jerusalem. Notice he didn't go to Jerusalem. There's no triumphal entry if you go straight to Jerusalem. The triumphal entry is being 6 miles away from Jerusalem, not 6 miles, 2 miles away from Jerusalem, 6 days before, and then going out to meet him and bringing him into the city. And that's where we find ourselves today with Jesus, is he's in the city. Now he's there for the Passover. And yes, this is the very last Passover that he'll ever observe with his disciples on this side of eternity. But this is that time that we've all studied about so much, that this is his last time on earth. This is the last Lord's Supper. This is the last time that he'll get to be in the upper room with his disciples, teaching them in chapters 14, 15, and 16. Shortly thereafter, he's going to be arrested. He's going to be put to death. And of course, resurrected. But for now, what we're going to take a look at is the people's reaction to Jesus. And that's what we're going to take a look at today. And this really encapsulates it perfectly, is Isaiah 53. So if you want to go there with me, to Isaiah 53, we're going to read, excuse me, all 12 verses. And this really has to do with our lesson today. And keep in mind all of the miracles that Jesus had done. Keep in mind all the sermons that he had taught, all the private conversations with the leaders, all the private conversations with his own apostles. Keep in mind John chapter 6, when he preached the sermon about the bread from heaven, and about how they need to feed on him and not just on physical bread, and how many disciples walked away that day. Keep in mind his resurrection of Lazarus, and how that was the most momentous miracle that he had done up to that point, and probably since, because raising from the dead is something that was, to say the least, impossible for a man to do. And so here in 53 really encapsulates from Jesus' birth all the way to his death. And this is really what we're going to talk about, because remember, if we're graphing Jesus' popularity, he starts off relatively unknown, right? So this is whenever you deal with a subject of like troubleshooting or whatever, you always have to start with the baseline, right? Baseline. What does this look like on a normal day, right? This is a normal Jesus. He just came out of Nazareth. He grew up. He's a normal kid. We know he's not normal. But this is his baseline, right? He's going to start teaching you, he just water into wine, right? Goes up a little bit, he's up a little bit, right? This is the Lazarus right here, right? The Lazarus effect, one might say.
Yeah, right.
That actually is a movie, by the way.
Oh.
So this is Lazarus right here, okay? Now he's back in Jerusalem at this moment. And at this moment, and there's been little peaks and valleys where the Pharisees have wanted to do away with him and all that. But ever since he did this, they said they plotted to kill him. They want him dead. And now they're just looking. It's not a moment, it's not a question of, hey, we'll get to him when we get to him. It's now we're actively going to seek to kill him. And that's really where the difference ended up being. This is his popularity. This is the height of his being talked about, the height of the awareness and all these other things. And you would think that in all this time here, all the thousands, 10,000s of miracles, that people would start really believing in it. You would think. But then you read Isaiah 53 and you're like, well, wait a minute, that's supposed to happen? Maybe not. So let's get into this here. Verse 53, or chapter 53, verse 1. Isaiah says, and keep in mind this entire chapter is about Jesus, the entire thing. So he says, who has believed our report? Why is he having to question that? If it's about Jesus, why wouldn't you want to believe in him? Well, there's been lots of people that haven't done that, but we're talking about during his ministry on earth. This is the question he has, who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He has no form or beauty, and when we see, or he has no form or splendor, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. Remember, this is Jesus' baseline, right? This is him as he is, without any miracles, nothing like that. It's just straight up Jesus. Hasn't done anything yet. There's nothing appealing about him. Remember, before they made Saul king, he wasn't king yet. What was he? Best looking man, taller than anybody else that there was in Israel. That's who he was. Well, Jesus had none of that going for him, and I believe that was on purpose. Because why would we want to be attracted to his outward beauty and not the inward beauty, right? Ultimately, the outward beauty fades, it goes away, but it's the inward beauty that sticks around.
You know, I keep going back to that Shroud of Turin.
Mm-hmm.
If that's it, can everyone imagine that picture?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, can you imagine it? Pretty popular by now.
Mm-hmm.
That's now kind of what I'm imagining, the possibility, not this Roman-looking person that we've grown up with, a picture in our living room, you know.
Right.
But I'm seeing it more kind of on that order. Maybe something like that. You know, I could be wrong, but that's interesting. That shroud is pretty interesting.
Yeah, or certainly not the way the Mormons portray him, with blonde hair and blue eyes.
Right.
It's always puzzled me.
Yeah.
Talk about standing out.
Uh-huh.
You know, that goes right against Scripture, so that's really nothing to, to play with, but yet they do. And so he doesn't have this beauty, he doesn't have this attractiveness as the world would see him, that we should desire him. In fact, he's despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Wow, what a life. How would you like your life to be said? If you were to read about your life before you lived it, and you knew that you were going to be acquainted with grief, you were going to be sorrowful. I mean, these aren't terms that we would want for ourselves, are they?
No.
We wouldn't choose that for ourselves. But here's Jesus knowing what his life would be like on earth before he lived it. He says, and he's acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. So even like, Brother Noah read this morning about Peter and the denial that he would face. Jesus was despised. He wasn't looked down in the world as somebody special. There was times that he was, but overall, the world just largely ignored him. And they did one worse, they rejected him. Isn't that what it says? Verse 3, he was despised and rejected by a man. So it's bad enough to not esteem somebody. That's what despised means. You're not going to esteem them to their proper place, but you're also going to reject them. That's a double whammy there. That's striking you on one cheek and then offering the other. And so he says, we didn't esteem him. We didn't esteem him. Is he collectively talking about Israel? He might be.
The nation. Yeah.
That's saying that when we had our opportunity to see the Son of God, we blew it. And this is what ties into John today. He says, surely he has borne our griefs. This is the part that Israel's going to stumble on today, is the fact that, this is not just the fact that Jesus is but dealing with the fact that he's grieving and despised and rejected, and he doesn't have beauty, as it were. It's not just that. Israel could handle that. Jesus could handle that. But what Israel couldn't handle is this next part. He says, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. He was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. So this is the part that Israel didn't want. They wanted that champion to ride into Jerusalem with all sorts of pomp and circumstance and singing and shouting, and for him to go marching into Jerusalem, take out the leadership, take out Rome, set up the kingdom of God triumphantly. They wanted that triumphal entry to continue. And so when Jesus starts talking about his death, They're scratching their head. What are you doing? You're supposed to be our hero. You're supposed to be our number one. You're supposed to be the one that delivers us from these people. And you're talking about dying? And so what they had to do is look back in Isaiah 53, but they didn't want to look there. They wanted that champion. They wanted the one that was going to defeat Rome. So verses like this, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Now it's going into his trial, right? We can kind of place these events. They couldn't place these events when they read these the first time. They couldn't say, oh yeah, Pontius Pilate of Rome. Who's Rome? Who in the world is Pontius Pilate? Right? What's a praetorian? You know, what's a centurion? They don't know those words. But looking back 2,000 years ago, we can place all these things exactly how they happened. And so we understood that Jesus didn't talk when he was under accusation. First thing we want to do when we're being accused wrongfully is to defend ourselves. It comes natural. But Jesus didn't do that. He didn't defend himself.
Andrew, do you remember Pilate's words when Jesus kept silent? Pilate was marveled.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't you know I have the power to release you?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
He was, any other man would have been screaming and pleading for his life.
Knowing what was going to happen to him.
Yeah.
Not just the fact that he was going to be crucified, but all the stuff leading up to that. And the pain and the anguish that he'd have to endure. Then he was crucified. Is something you
Well, and I don't know if it was Brother Mike or somebody else in the devotional fairly recently that, you know, Jesus wasn't murdered. He gave his life, and I think his calmness,
That's right.
you know, and his unwillingness to, you know, yell and scream and holler, I'm innocent, was the evidence of that.
Yep. That's exactly it. And this is exactly what this talks about. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. So this is the part now. It dealt with suffering, it dealt with chastisement, it dealt with our sins being laid on him, which I'm pretty sure the Jews were fine with, knowing they needed a Savior. But the part they stumbled on was him being cut off from the land of the living. That's the part they didn't know willingly, they didn't want to know. He says, for the transgressions of my people he was stricken, and they made his grave with the wicked. You mean he has to die? Come on, that's not going to happen. They made his grave with the wicked, and the rich, but with the rich at his death. He remembers that. Joseph of Arimathea was a rich man. Didn't he purchase Jesus' tomb? See, we can fill all these blanks in now. This was hundreds of years before any of these things happened, and it was already prophesied. He says, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, you shall see it. He shall see his seed, and he shall prolong his days in the pleasure of the Lord. That verse tells it all right there. You could sum everything up in that verse. See, God had to put Jesus to death, as it were. And like you said, he didn't, was not murdered. His life was not taken from him. He gave his life up. Why? Well, because that's what God told him to do. We're going to see that today. He says, I only speak the things I heard from the Father, and I'm only doing the things I heard from the Father. And so, for him to be murdered would have completely, negated any of this. He gave his life up willingly. And so he says here, because he put him to grief, because he made his soul an offering for sin. What do we always say? Suffering before glory, right? He shall see his seed, those people that his seed means his offspring. Who are those people? That's us. That's the church, and has been the church throughout the ages. He shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. You mean his pleasure, which means that whatever he wants to happen is going to happen, even after he's been put to death. Doesn't this sound like a resurrected Christ? He shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied. See, all this other stuff dealt with pain and grief and sorrows and death. And now we're seeing the other side of it after the resurrection. and we're seeing that his pleasure is now being accomplished. He shall see the labor of his soul, be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong. What does that sound like? Sounds like the inheritance. It sounds like Jesus being the first fruits, being resurrected, and now sharing that inheritance. But see, none of this is possible if he doesn't go through with the pain. And I guess that's my point today. You have to go through with the pain to get the reward. And a lot of people look at this and say, I don't want that. Well, they didn't want Jesus to die either, but he had to. He had to do it. So he says, therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he will divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul unto death. And he was numbered with the transgressors. Who did he die with on the cross? People that had stolen, 2 thieves. And he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. This is what his life, and if you encapsulate his life in one chapter, that this is what it is. You have something else?
Well, just thought, going to Brother Phil's lesson too, about the trail of blood. Jesus set the standards, or the
Example.
the example, thank you, for all these martyrs to come too, people who believed in him. He went quietly. He knew that he was being falsely accused. He knew that his followers would be falsely accused. You look at all those martyrs who died, the only wrong that they did was following Christ when everybody else around them was following whatever figment of their imagination they could come up with. And so you set that example, set that pattern for those people, so that they wouldn't beg and plead and cry, I'm innocent, I didn't do a thing. They would know that Christ did it before. They had that, so that I think that they could go more strongly into that martyrdom.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that, when Peter was following Jesus that night when he was arrested, and he saw Jesus being accused and didn't retaliate. He didn't suddenly call in witnesses. He didn't suddenly call in angels. He didn't, knowing all of Jesus' power that he possibly had in all the world, and that his Father would listen to anything he said, that he restrained himself and didn't do that. That caused Peter to write the words in 1 Peter, 2 Peter, forget where it is, but he says that if you're going to be accused of something bad, let it be for doing good, instead of letting it be from our own mouth and giving ourselves handing someone else a noose and saying, tie this around my neck. And so Jesus didn't, he didn't back down, but then again, he didn't call for help. And this is what he says here. Let's go ahead over to John chapter 12, and we'll try to finish this chapter out today. And so keep in mind, at our portion in the account, in the story so far, he's at this high. He's at the apex, if you will, of his power. Not necessarily just power, but popularity. You don't just get triumphantly entered into Jerusalem unless you want to make that person your king. And so, one of the very last things in our scriptures that we read last week, verse 19, this didn't escape the Pharisees. They said, the Pharisees therefore said among themselves, you see that you are accomplishing nothing. Look, the world has gone after him. Well, he's on the high right now. Not that Jesus rode highs and lows. The people rode highs and lows, okay? Christ's message had not changed. It's just that now people are starting, you would think, to really believe it. But they're going to run into a brick wall here in just a second. What's that brick wall? Let's take a look. Verse 27. He says, now my soul is troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I came to this hour. Why is his soul troubled? Would your soul be troubled when you were at the height of your popularity and you knew they wanted to make you king? You could see the kingdom just around the corner. All you had to do was defeat Rome to get there. Why would your soul be troubled? You should be happy. This should be a time of celebration and more pomp and more excitement and all these other things. Why would his soul be troubled? Does anyone have a response? Isaiah 53. He knew what he had to go through. He knew that in order to get to where he was going, he had to suffer. He had to be put to death. Those aren't pleasant things. And so Jesus, his soul now is troubled. And the time when you would think that he'd be the happiest, hey, the word's starting to get to people. No, it's not. He says, my soul is now troubled because of the things that he sees. He now has a clear path to his impending death and all the things that surrounded that. He now can see clearly what's going to happen to him, and now knows that it's a very, very short time away.
I think Israel wanted them to be king for the wrong reasons too. They wanted to be their independent nation. They wanted to be out from the yoke of Rome, but I think in their minds he'd just be another king, another conqueror, rather than, you know, this eternal, entering into this eternal kingdom, and they're focusing their service on the Lord. They just wanted to be out of the service of everybody else, to be, you know, to rule themselves.
Yeah, definitely, you know, a pride thing, because that's the reason that Israel wanted a king in the first place, right? Now, we don't want to do this whole judges thing. We want our own king, and we wanted to be able to see him and be able to have him meet with other leaders and feel like a real nation, right? Meanwhile, God was their king. That wasn't good enough for him. But yeah, I think, you know, they definitely had the wrong reasons. As we'll see here in a sec. So he says, what am I going to say? He says, yes, I'm troubled. I'm distraught because I know what's going to happen. You know, he had that, I would say, disadvantage of knowing exactly what's going to happen. As much as we would like to see the future, I think we wouldn't really want to see our future. You know, I think that's, you probably just would, it would affect your life, obviously, if you knew exactly what was going to happen to you. But Jesus had that disadvantage at this moment where he could see his future. And he did know all those things.
And I think he's balancing the terror and fear that he feels for what's coming and saying, Father, let this glorify your name.
Yeah.
So, and I think that was the struggle, especially as they got closer. And I think that's why the sort of big, not ending miracle, but it kind of seemed to be toward the end of his ministry, this Lazarus effect.
Yeah.
I think that it ended, his ministry sort of ended with that. I mean, that's kind of how it seems to me.
Yeah.
That happened right before all of this, because I think he needed to have one big last thing to sort of resonate throughout, create that popularity. But your chart maps popularity with the people and anger by the leadership
Sure.
at the same time. So as that went up and down, you know, as he was less popular, they didn't care.
Yeah.
The more popular he got, the more they were angry. That's a tough balance, because you understand in living our lives the fear of what, you know, the devil's capable of in your life, and hating that, but also wanting to say, but Lord, your will be done. And so that's not easy for people sometimes to balance, because you're trying to say one thing and feeling another, and then once you start feeling that other thing, then it becomes more real for you. But in the meantime, I think it's happening for him. It's happening in that the whole reason I'm here is because of right now.
Exactly.
And so he's like, I wish I could do this 10,000 angel and get me out of here thing, but I can't. The whole reason why I was born is for this moment right now. But yet, Lord, Father, glorify your name, which is a hard thing to do.
And that's what he's being faced with right now. It was years away. It was 30 years away, right? Then he starts his ministry. Now it's 3 years away, 2 years away. It's now just a couple of weeks away at this moment, if even that, right? So,
and I think as it got closer, now we see his experience in the garden, and now we're hours away,
Right.
Instead of years away. Now we're hours away and then minutes away. I think once the suffering began, I think, like we talked about on Wednesday, that I think he had this element of grace that the Lord provides for all of his people. But I think it was the anticipation leading up to it. Once that first strike or that first whip, I think at that point the Lord covered him with that grace. But it's the anticipation of that. It's the click, 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 click as you're going up Thunder Mountain, right? Click, 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 click here, as it does that, that's the scary part. Once you're down, you're going, right? Okay.
Yeah.
But it's the anticipation and the fear and nervousness going up that roller coaster, and then you go on the other side. And that made me nervous just talking about that.
Maybe we should
Thunder
stay away from
Mountain,
roller
if you
coasters.
remember, it's very scary. Yeah.
But, that's just it, and if nothing else, this is just another notch on the side of Jesus' humanity, right? Would he say that his soul is troubled if he wasn't really feeling the feelings that we feel? No, he is, and that's why it says he's our forerunner, and that's why it says that there's nothing that Jesus hasn't gone through that we won't go through, or I should reverse that. There's nothing that we'll ever go through that he hasn't already gone through. And that's such a comfort, it really is a comfort to me. We know we can call on him, we know we can lean on him and pray to him and say, Lord, I know you've been through this. It may not have been specifically my circumstance, but you've been through this, and you've been through more. And so for us to lean on him is the best thing that what we can do. Verses like this remind me that he's human, not just God, but he's human.
Would you call it the Lazarus what?
Effect.
The Lazarus effect, and I never looked at it until you guys were talking about that. I never looked at it like this, but you're right. He saved this one. He pulled this one out toward the end. I think because of its effect, it would ratchet up this
Hysteria.
This hysteria. Okay, and I'm looking at, we have an effect, or we have a day that we recall now in our recent history that's ratcheted things up, and we always go back to that day. 9/11 now is like that Lazarus effect that's ratcheted the world up, okay, and it's just things have changed since then. So I think this was meant, it was calculated to ratchet things up. So because he knew this would be his last trip around to Passover, and this is it,
This is
okay?
it.
You gotta ratchet it up, and so I didn't look at it that way before. This was calculated for that.
Yeah, I never thought about it, because if you'd asked me when, at the time in his ministry that he raised Lazarus from the dead, I would have said, I don't know, first year, second year.
Yeah.
But really, it's right there at the end. At this moment, he's got weeks to live.
Yeah, Lazarus could have died a year into his ministry, 6 months into his
Right.
ministry. He could have raised other people from the dead.
Yeah.
That maybe had more popularity. He could have raised a Pharisee from the dead at some point. I mean, there's other things he could have done. This seems to be timed though. I mean, this seems to be sort of strategic in its timing to be, sort of like 9/11. It was strategic. That could have happened 10 years prior, could have happened 10 years later. It was strategic in its timing. And so I think with this, it definitely was.
Yeah, there's no coincidence here, not at all. And so he is now, and he really hasn't, in our study so far, he hasn't really spoken like this before. He's been troubled for other things, but not looking at the death on the cross. So now he has to come to grips now with this, and this is the very, very beginning of that, of us looking at that. And this culminates, of course, in the garden, right? When now it's not just gonna be in a couple weeks, it's gonna be in a couple of minutes, right? So he says here, my soul's troubled, and what shall I say? He says, Father, save me from this hour? Am I gonna come this far in my ministry and done everything that I did and was sent by God and all those things just to say, bail me out? Have we come so far in our Christian walk that at the end of our lives, we'll just say, God, just bail me out? Or not even God bail me out, I'm just gonna bail out. We're studying about it on Wednesday nights. A whole slew of people, millions of people that didn't ask for God just bail them out or just bail out. There were those that bailed out.
Yeah.
We're not talking about those people. We don't ever want to be those people. We want to be the ones that didn't bail out because Jesus didn't bail out. And I think it was some of the Fox and Quick martyrs or who said that famous quote. It says, God's been faithful to me my whole life. Why would I now turn that around and not be faithful to him?
Not to bring this up, but in my studies, there are reports or just sort of discussion points anyway, because there's no real proof to it, but there's many who actually believe as many as were killed, as that same number of people actually recanted their faith to the Lord. That is, I think it's about a 50-50 number.
Wow.
So that shows how many people were of faith that were being pursued. So again, if you go with that 50 million number, then there's another 50 million, it's sort of assumed, because again, there's no proof of it,
Sure.
but it's discussed anyway that that many people said no. And so they're not even counted amongst the martyrs. Many were still killed, but, even afterwards, which is a worse punishment.
Right.
I don't know what's worse, is dying in that sin or still living with yourself for years later. Pick your poison there. But that same number said no, that they're okay with walking away from the Lord and the blessings and all of that, and then they were either killed or, they let them live. But either way, if it's the same number, that means that there were 100 million of our forefathers who were pursued, and chased by these early groups, so.
If you look at the rate, and we'll take a look at this if we have time today, just really quickly in Acts. If you look at the rate of people being added to the church,
Yeah.
these people were primed, and they were,
Thousands
like you
at
said,
a
yeah,
time.
thousands at a time, and that's the thing is, these people were, the word had just gone out in mass in that area. And so we're only talking about this area. When we talk about 50 million people of our Anabaptist brethren, we're not talking about any other place other than this place. Asia, Middle East, Europe, those areas there. We're only talking about that area. And so Catholics got their hands on a lot of people, and a lot of people did say no. But we don't want to focus on that. Just like Jesus, he didn't focus on that. He says, for this purpose, I came to this hour. Everything I've ever done up to this point is now going to culminate in this time. And I'm not going to let my Lord down. I'm not going to let my Father down. Verse 20, it says, Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven saying, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. Therefore the people who stood by and heard it said that it had thundered. Others said an angel had spoken to him. Either way, they kind of missed the boat, right?
So this is saying they didn't hear that.
They're
They heard
saying
thunder,
the thunder,
so they didn't hear God say.
either they didn't hear it or they didn't want to hear it. I don't know. We have to be spiritually tuned to hear things. And if you're not spiritually tuned to hear things, you're not going to hear it. And so you could someone could sit down and read the Bible, but they're not going to get anything out of it unless the Lord reveals it to them. I'm more convinced of that than ever. It's a two-way street. You have to be called, but you have to respond. And we're going to see here, if we get to it, that's exactly what happens. Then Jesus answered and said, this voice did not come because of me, but for your sake. And I like this part, because he's giving them a taste of what Isaiah 53 gave us when Christ was resurrected. Now it doesn't say that Jesus will be resurrected in Isaiah 53. It just simply says after he's done being murdered and all those other things, not murdered, but done being put to death, done being, suffering and all that, what does he get to do? He gets to have victory, right? He gets to have a piece of that glory. And so Jesus, foreseeing this event, knowing what would happen, doesn't focus on the pain, doesn't focus on the misery, doesn't focus on the agony. He focuses on what's going to happen because he's going through these things. He focuses on the end result. And what's he saying? He says, now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. And if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself. He's saying, that's what's going to happen. It's not just going to fizzle. This isn't just going to die. I'm not going to just stop. He's saying the judgment of this world can now begin, which means that Jesus is resurrected to be the judge. Remember, he's looking forward to these things. He's saying the ruler of the world can now be cast out. It's to say that Jesus did when he died. He got rid of sin, the last death, or the last enemy to be defeated was death. Satan had that power over people, death. But because Jesus is resurrected, and we identify with him in that resurrection, we defeat death. We don't cheat death, we defeat death. And so he says, verse 32, and he's telling them, he said, I need to be lifted up from the earth. I need to be crucified. And they knew what he meant. And he's going to draw all peoples to myself. Not just the Jews, but the Gentiles. All peoples will come to me because of this event. Now, he's happy about it. I can see that he's trying to be happy about it. He's trying to see past the pain. He's trying to say, even though my soul is troubled, here's what I get and here's what you get. He's wrapping all this up into one. John says, this he said, signifying by what death he would die. The people answered him, we have heard from the law that the Christ remains forever. And how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is the Son of Man? If you're asking that question after everything you've seen, you've kind of missed the boat. And Jesus said to them, a little while longer the light is with you. Walk while you have the light, lest darkness overtake you. He who walks in darkness does not know where he is going. He's saying, I'm only going to be here a little while longer, guys. You've got to jump on board. You've got to get it. He says, while you have the light, believe in the light, that you may become sons of light. These things Jesus spoke and departed and was hidden from them. I think he was disappointed in them. Who is the Son of Man? What are you talking about? You're going to die. Who is the Son of Man? You're going to live forever. That's what the scriptures say. So the Christ is going to live forever. Whether or not you're the Christ, we don't know, because you just said you're going to die. Verse 37 just makes me want to beat my head against a wall. We have those little emoticons at work and instant message, it's got a wall here and a guy ramming his head into it. If I could do that, I would type that in for 37. He says, but although he had done so many signs before them, they did not believe in him. What about our graph?
Yeah.
Little sigh.
All in the same chapter,
I know.
from the beginning of the chapter to the end. King, Hail, King of Israel, to what?
Yeah.
Oh.
I think it was the fact that they brought him in, they'd seen all the miracles, he had raised Lazarus from the dead, and now he's talking about how he has to die.
Well, it just goes to show how fickle people are too.
Oh, absolutely.
How, if it's not something that's happening right in front of us, then we forget about it almost immediately sometimes. I think it just goes to show how much we need to keep ourselves towing that line. Reminding ourselves of all those times when these things have happened. All the counsel we have in here, or else, especially in my life, I just forget. I fall away, and then pray and pray and pray, and the Lord shows me another sign, and good for a while, and forget again.
Yeah.
It's amazing how Satan works that way.
Yeah. And we are as fickle at times as these people were, let's face it, And I think a lot of it is the fact that these things didn't happen like they thought they were going to happen. And how often does life go as we plan?
These people, I doubt these people who wanted to make him king had just heard about him at that moment. They had 3 years.
Oh, yeah.
They had 3 years, and these are, last minute Lucy's who are finally coming around and saying, okay, well, now we'll listen to him.
Yeah.
This was their last hurrah, which, of course, we're in the last times, right? So we're in we're the last, could be the last generation. So really, but these guys had listened to him for 3 years. These aren't, 4-year-olds who are doing this. These are people who are of age,
Right.
who had heard him for 3 years, and they are just now inquiring about who he is and what he has to say. And then when he says it, they still didn't believe. So really, whether it was last second people or people at the very beginning of his ministry, which is why the parable of the sower is so good, the ground was the same. The ground was the same for everyone, whether it was 3 years ago or right before his death. People didn't believe no matter what he did.
Yeah.
Well, the Pharisees, their leadership set them up for this. They taught them, and you've heard of the term misinformation. You've also heard the term disinformation. Okay, so I think Isaiah 53 would be probably misinformation. They probably didn't talk about that much because they had no idea what is that all about. The disinformation would be that this way that Christ would come when he came. Okay, that's totally off base there.
Yeah.
So armed with that and listening to their teachers, And as we get down further into this chapter, they're afraid of turning away. They're afraid of walking away from the teachers, or they'll be excommunicated, you know. So I think they just didn't want to let go and just wholeheartedly believe Jesus, because they were afraid
Yeah.
to,
Absolutely.
you know.
Because, he didn't come in the way that, and Jesus made up for it in the miracles, but he didn't come in the way they thought he would come in. They said, well, we're not supposed to even know where this Christ is
Right.
from. You know what they said?
Right.
Oh, well, he's from, we know this man, but we're not supposed to know where the real one comes from. Okay, he had that strike against him.
Yeah.
And then, the other one was, then that was balanced out though with, as they were talking about that, we know his brothers, we know his mother, we know his father, we know where he's from. But some of them came to reason and said, well, but if he really is the Christ, can you picture, but you're saying he's not the Christ because we don't know where he's from, but when the real Christ comes, will he really do more miracles than this man? So that was balanced out, right? So I think Jesus, quote unquote, made up for it for the miracle's sake. But then he said he needs to die, another strike against him in their eyes. Because they said, no, the Christ has to live forever. I mean, what? And like you said, it starts off with the leadership teaching them that it had to be this way. We're not supposed to know where he's from. He's going to live forever. He's going to tackle Rome. And then you have that idea. And then you have Jesus standing you in the face, standing right in front of your face. And he's not what you expected. He's not nice to look at. He'd know where he's from. He's saying he's going to die. All the things that went against what they were taught.
Looking at it that way too, it makes more sense on how people today, we're told that in those end days that a lot of people are gonna fall away. We see that same sort of thing where we have the prophecies, we have, these things that are gonna happen, but we don't quite know exactly when or how. I think that, just like this, like you guys were saying, how Israel probably, had all those problems because of that. I think that's what's gonna cause a big problem for a lot of people, and not just, people of the world, but even brethren who will fall away because of these things, because they get so caught up in what they think they know, how they think they know these things are gonna happen, that when it's happening right in front of them,
Right.
they kind of have that block in their vision, as it were, they have the blinders on.
And that's what he says in this verse. He quotes this verse.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to go to Isaiah 53 to grab the whole context. He says they didn't believe him, even after all these miracles, they didn't believe him. That the word of Isaiah, the prophet, might be fulfilled, which he spoke. Lord, who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Therefore they could not believe, because Isaiah said again, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, lest they should see with their eyes, lest they should understand with their hearts, and turn, that I should heal them. The question is, why would God blind people? Why would he turn away their hearts? And the thing I came up with, my question is, does that only work one way? Can God only reveal things, or can he also hide things? I think he can do both, and I think he did both. Look at, in certain circumstances, I think he hides things from people, such as Pharaoh, hardened his heart. The ones in that we talk about in Revelation in the end days, he sends them a strong delusion. See, it works both ways. God can reveal things, and God can hide things, depending on what he wants to do at that moment. And so here, these people, he needed to blind them to fulfill his purpose. Now, had Israel accepted him, it would have been Rome, entirely Rome, seeing an uprising and saying, we don't like this new leader, let's put him to death. He still would have had to have died. He still would have been a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief and all those things. But he would have been put to death by the Romans, and the kingdom would have come in at that time had the Jews accepted him. But as we can see in verse 37, they didn't accept him. It says, verse 41 says, these things Isaiah said when he saw his glory and spoke of him. That's a whole other subject of Isaiah seeing Jesus and speaking of him. It's a whole other topic. Now I like verse 42. It says, nevertheless, even if all these people didn't believe in him, it says, even among the rulers, many believed in him. How could you not? You're supposed to know the scriptures. You're supposed to be the one close to God. And here you have to consciously deny the fact that you know this is Christ. How many times their heads hit the pillow and say, this has to be Jesus. I'm sorry, this has to be Christ. This has to be. It has to be. And they knew better. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. The one thing they held over everyone's head was being put out of the synagogue. It says, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. Now, I don't know if that's talking about the Pharisees loving the praise of men more than of God, or if it's the other leaders who love the praise of men more than the praise of God. I think it's the leaders, not willing to make that leap, crossing the line and saying, crossing the picket line, as it were, and saying, oh, I'm going to go over here and side with Jesus.
And staying good with the Pharisees.
Because they loved the Pharisees' praise. They like the Good Old Boys Club. It was too hard to leave the Good Old Boys Club. It says, then Jesus cried out and said, he who believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. And he who sees me sees him who sent me. I have come as a light into the world, that whoever believes in me should not abide in darkness. And if anyone hears my voice and does not believe, I do not judge him. For I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. Now there's coming a day when that won't be true. There's coming a day when Jesus will judge the world. But his first ministry, the first time that he came, he's not judging the world. He came to save the world. There's a time and a place for everything. So he says, he who rejects me and does not receive my words has that which judges him. The word that I have spoken will judge him in the last day. So instead of Jesus coming 2,000 years ago to come and judge the world, put the world under isn't that what the law did? Isn't that what the law did? Was the law full of grace? No. The law came to expose sin for what it was. Now try to live up to it. Okay. Did anyone really live up to the law? So interwoven with the law was a thread of you need grace, or else you can't serve God. So Jesus comes along and says, here's grace, here's mercy, here's my words. I'm not going to judge you now. That's not what I'm going to do. But here's what I'm doing. I'm leaving my words in the earth for everybody, boy, girl, man, woman, to look at. And at the end of your life, in the judgment, that's when you'll be judged by these same words.
Gave us opportunity to do something.
Yep. And so our punishment or reward, either one, is not immediate. We have to live our lives. We have to go to the end of our lives, as it were. And we don't know when that's going to be. But at the same time, we need to live our lives, live through them, and make good decisions. And he says that there's a punishment for those that don't and a reward for those that do. He says, he who rejects me and does not receive my words has that which judges him. The word that I have spoken will judge him in the last day. For I have not spoken on my own authority. It's not Jesus making stuff up. He says, but the Father who sent me gave me a command what I should say and what I should speak. His judgment doesn't just start with himself. It already came through God, the authority, and now all he's doing is simply relaying that authority and saying, God's given me the authority. Isn't that what he says in the Great Commission? I have been given the authority. To do what? Well, he's given that to the church, to bind, to loose, baptism. I mean, all the things that he has authority to do, the church does too. It says, and I know that his command is everlasting life. Therefore, whatever I speak, just as the Father told me, so I speak. So, Jesus wasn't rogue. He wasn't going rogue. He followed his Father's footsteps. Chain of command, the authority, all those things. And here's the catch, though. We can't just make something up. Brother Philip on Wednesday nights going through a whole slew. If you look in the back of that pamphlet, you see a whole bunch of churches that made it up. We aren't commissioned to make things up. We're commissioned to follow through, just as Jesus did, with something that was already there from eternity. All we're doing is simply relaying that information. People have to choose what they're going to choose. And in the is there to judge. As Jesus has left us an example. We get to judge one another. Jesus says, I'm not here to judge. We aren't here to judge each other in the same way that Jesus wasn't there to judge. Now, we need to be responsible, of course, in the things that God's given us. He says, you can't know the people's heart. Don't judge the heart. Don't judge the intent. Judge their fruits. Because he says, by your fruits, you'll know what's really inside your heart. And so we are to judge a little bit as far as what we can see. Only God can judge what we can't see. It won't be one of us standing there giving a judgment for somebody else in the end. Only God knows what really went on in our hearts and our minds. And so, I hope that, our lesson kind of pointed out that in spite of Jesus' popularity and with man, and boy, that was fleeting, wasn't it? Sure didn't last long.
Right.
You have the same people cutting down palm branches, and you have the same people spreading their clothes out on the road for Jesus to ride in triumphantly, are the same ones who don't believe him in the same picture. But here's a little bit of, just to end on this, here's a little bit of hope, I guess. A lot of those same people that rejected him that day are the same ones in a couple weeks, or months, that get added to the church on the day of Pentecost. And then, not just the day of Pentecost, but Peter and John speak later, and another 5,000 were added, 3,000 were added. So there's hope for those people. So yeah, they would have rejected him that day, but I think a lot of those people, including the Pharisees, we'll see that in Acts, they come around and they start believing. And so all the seed is being sown, all these things are happening in real time, but we miss a lot of things when they're happening in real time. It's one of those things where we can, it's so, the past is so much clearer when, I say, the events are so much clearer when we can view them from the past, or I'm sorry, in the future. You look back at them as they are now the past. It's like, oh, that makes a lot more sense.
Hindsight's 20/20.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's so true. And you just wish you could go back and say, enjoy this time, or you can get through this time, or, but we can't do that. We don't have that ability. And so for these people who accepted him later when Peter stood up there in Acts chapter 2 and preached that message, remembered that they had rejected him that day. And they were the ones shouting out, put him to death. Go back and just say, no, accept him. Can't do that. We have to pick it up and move on. That's our job. So. All right, if anyone